Okay, welcome back to our study of Ezekiel. And this summer, we're going to wrap up Ezekiel part 1. If we can tonight, this may be a problem. And we are going to be with chapter 29 tonight, if you need to get that out. All right, everybody, I may have prematurely said God doesn't want us to cancel class, so we'll see how it goes. I haven't talked this much all day, so apparently when I talk, it's going to force me to cough. Okay, chapter 29, for those of you who might remember this, if you haven't kind of jotted this down as sort of the lineup for your at a glance worksheet, this is how the chapters we've done so far line up. And this will be important when we start even part 2. So chapters 1 through 3, does anybody remember or know how we would group those together or how we would categorize them? I don't really expect you to, but if somebody knows, I'd love to hear from you.
Visions.
Yeah, but that was just chapter 1. So we want to put chapters 1 through 3 all together. That vision was part of what God was doing at the beginning of the book, which is who has got the book's name?
Ezekiel.
Ezekiel. So God was calling and preparing Ezekiel in chapters 1 through 3. So I called it the calling and preparation of Ezekiel. I think some people just call it his calling, but we talked a lot about how God used those first words to prepare Ezekiel for what he was going to ask him to do. Chapters 4 all the way to 24 were all really about one topic. What were they about?
Chapter 4 through what?
24.
Judgments?
Yeah, the judgments on who?
On Israel.
Enemies.
On Israel. Yeah, so 4 through
Israel.
24, Israel, specifically a lot of the time Jerusalem, but we saw parts where he talked fully about Israel because sometimes he's talking right to those captives. They're not in Jerusalem. And sometimes he's talking about the nation. So you could have both the judgment of Jerusalem and Israel. And then that will lead you right into what chapters 25 to 28 were about.
Judgment of Israel's enemies.
Good. Or the judgment of, what's the other word we use for those people? The nations. The nations.
Oh,
Good.
yeah.
Good. So this is something we'll hit again when we start again in the fall, because watch what happens when we start that second section of Ezekiel. Okay.
Gloating nations.
Gloating nations.
Gloating.
Nice. Gloating nations. Yeah.
Loathing?
Gloating or prideful.
Prideful. Good word.
Prideful.
Yeah, we're going to keep looking at that. It's a good time to be talking about pride. So if Ezekiel's message, God prepared him in 3 chapters, then he spent the rest of 25 chapters doing 2 things, talking about judgment coming to his people and talking about judgment coming to those people's enemies. So if God is judging Israel, if he has a judgment for his own people, and he has a judgment for nations who don't claim him, don't call themselves by his name, what would that tell you? What's a takeaway you would want to think about What does that mean to you? If God can declare judgments on his own people, but also on others? What does that mean?
He's God.
He's God.
Equally treats people.
Okay, he equally treats people. The justice we talked about in the prayer time. Yeah.
He takes sin seriously.
Yep.
He's fair.
He's fair according to his justice, his scales, right?
Right.
What he calls
Mhm.
fair. So that's a thing that I think we need to keep a hold of, because it's possible that maybe the world, especially the world that doesn't know him, of course, doesn't know this about him. That they don't know that just because they don't claim him, that he doesn't claim them, and that he doesn't claim authority over them. And we're watching that in his word and believing that his word is always true. Would that mean that then that would still hold true today, that God would judge his own people, the people called by his name, and those that aren't called by his name? Yeah, says God never changes. So that's something I just want you to hang on to, because that kind of sums up the whole first 28 chapters. And actually, by the time we're done here, it will actually sum up the first 32 chapters of Ezekiel, because as you can see in the section we have left, we're not changing topics. So we're going to get right to that with Ezekiel 29. We saw that in, I didn't even put anything here about the last chapters we did, but the last, was it 4 of them or 3? 26, 27, 28, is that right? We're on one nation. You guys remember what that one was?
I,
Higher. So that was a lot of time he spent on that one nation. Now he's going to spend, what, 4, 5 chapters? 29, 30, 4 more chapters on a different nation. And we're going to read and see who that is tonight. So let's see, where should I start? Sarah Sanchez, you look so comfortable. Do you mind reading? Okay, so Sarah Sanchez will take verses 1 to 7, Evelyn 8 to 12, our other sweet Sarah 13 to 16, and Laura 17 to 21. So if you're joining us and you want to just open to Ezekiel 29, that's all we're going to do. First thing is we're just going to read it. All right, whenever you ladies are ready.
Okay, in the 10th year, in the 10th month, on the 12th of the month, the word of the Lord came to me saying, Son of man, set your face against the Pharaoh king of Egypt and prophesy against him and against all Egypt. Speak and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, Pharaoh king of Egypt, the great monster that lies in the midst of his rivers, that has said, My Nile is mine, and I myself have made it. I will put hooks in your jaws and make the fish of your rivers cling to your scales, and I will bring you up out of the midst of your rivers, and all the fish of your rivers will cling to your scales. I will abandon you in the wilderness, you and all the fish of your rivers. You will fall on the open field. You will not be brought together or gathered. I have given you for food to the beasts of the earth and to the birds of the sky. Then all the inhabitants of Egypt will know that I am the Lord, because they have been only a staff made of reed to the house of Israel. When they took hold of you with the hand, you broke and tore all their hands. And when they leaned on you, you broke and made their loins quick.
Therefore, thus says the Lord God, Behold, I will bring upon you a sword, and I will cut off from you man and beast. The land of Egypt will become a desolation and waste. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Because you said, The Nile is mine, and I have made it. Therefore, behold, I am against you and against your rivers, and I will make the land of Egypt an utter waste and desolation, from Migdol to San and even to the border of Ethiopia. A man's foot will not pass through it, and the foot of a beast will not pass through it, and it will not be inhabited for 40 years. So I will make the land of Egypt a desolation in the midst of desolated lands, and her cities in the midst of cities that are laid waste will be desolate for 40 years, and I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them among the lands.
For thus says the Lord God, at the end of 40 years, I will gather the Egyptians from the peoples among whom they were scattered. I will turn the fortunes of Egypt and make them return to the land of Pathros, to the land of their origin, and there they will be a lowly kingdom. It will be the lowest of the kingdoms, and it will never again lift itself up above the nations. And I will make them so small that they will not rule over the nations. And it will never again be the confidence of the house of Israel, bringing to mind the iniquity of their having turned to Egypt. Then they will know that I am the Lord God.
Now in the 27th year, in the first month, on the first month, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made his army labor hard against Tyre. Every head was made bald, and every shoulder was rubbed bare. But he and his army had no wages from Tyre for the labor that he had performed against it. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, Behold, I will give the land of Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he will carry off her wealth and capture her spoil and seize her plunder, and it will be wages for his army. I have given him the land of Egypt for his labor, which he performed, because they acted for me, declares the Lord God. On that day, I will make a horn sprout for the house of Israel, and I will open your mouth in their midst. Then they will know that I am the Lord.
Okay, so before we even talk about the who, we're going to ask the question we've been starting with, because we're trying to track this as we go. Do we have a change in setting this time, which includes the time?
Yes.
Yes, and in fact, if you've done the homework in the workbook, you already know how we would answer this question. Is timing important in these last 4 chapters?
Yes.
Yeah, you have 2 charts for them. So we know that that's important. So we're just going to look at page 105 tonight. That's the one that's just the timeline. If you all want to grab yours, you can. I'm going to bring up a version of the same thing up on the screen so that we can look at it together, and we'll walk through it so we can see it. And also then, in case you weren't sure what they were looking for, you'll be able to see what to do with it. Share screen. Oh, wrong. Let me switch. Oh. You take a couple weeks off and your brain stops working. Mine does anyway. Okay. So this is how it looks pretty much in your workbook. And this is how to time these chapters based on Jehoiakim's exile. And we take that all the way back from the very first time frame God gave Ezekiel. He based it in that king's reign. So that's what we've been doing. And so now on your screen, you can see that the timeline is actually the years of his exile. And then they've highlighted the 10th, the 11th, and the 12th years. And they did the first one for us. They dated it. So this is chapter 29, verse 1. So they already have it in there for you. So that's all they're suggesting that you do. You can see that this also started with and shows us when these captives that Ezekiel's talking to, when they went into captivity. You can see that back at 605 BC. So it's been a while that they've been in, some of them in captivity, and then most likely most of them with Ezekiel in 597. But there was some that went in 605 as well. So that's all you're going to do on that, and that will help you to see how the time goes. It's a bit different in these chapters, and God has his reasons why he does that. I guess besides just keep us on our toes, maybe. So then the other sheet that you have is one that you're just going to use as your at a glance worksheet. And so every line where you get to put what a segment was about, you'll also be dating that segment just because it's going to help us keep track. So that's all we're looking at right now. And again, if you carry those times with you on your observation worksheet, you'll always have good track. So on your sheet or in your Bible, you would put 587 BC. We could see that now. That's the part I should have showed you while I had it up there. But verse 1 then would be 587 BC. Also, you could see it up there. How close are we to the destruction of Jerusalem at this point now? Anybody remember? It's on your
A
time.
year.
1 year away.
Here, right? It's all going to be gone within a year. So God is wrapping things up, and we kind of get that feeling here with this. Okay, so that's the timing that Ezekiel gives us for the beginning. And then one of the other things that we said that we definitely could use, you could look through scripture, but definitely in Ezekiel, you can look for this one repeated phrase to kind of help guide you through the things, the subjects that God's talking about. And we have another one of those in verse 1. And what is that?
And they will know that I am Lord.
In verse 1.
Oh, in verse 1.
Yeah, that's a good one
The
coming
word
up.
of the Lord.
The word of the Lord came to me, right? The word of the Lord came to me. So we've said that if you kind of track these, you can watch and see if that's when some of the subject headings change. All right. So in this new year, 587 BC, we have another word of the Lord. And what is it about?
A prophecy against Egypt.
Okay, so still prophecy, now it's against Egypt. So we've switched nations. And in fact, what should we add to that statement?
And Pharaoh. He calls out Pharaoh.
And Pharaoh. So he lists both. He lists Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and all Egypt. All Egypt. So the prophecy is towards both. So initially he starts off in fact speaking directly to whom?
Ezekiel.
Yep. Then Ezekiel speaks to
Pharaoh.
Pharaoh.
Man, Pharaoh.
And then it will change and it will be the whole nation. But you see this description, if you look at him with this prophecy against Pharaoh, these are God's words, God's description about him. What does he say? How's he described here?
Monster that lies in the midst of his rivers.
Proud.
Yeah. Yeah. So a sea monster, right? Or a river monster, I guess, not a sea monster. Somebody said he's proud. Where do you get pride? Because we always look at that. How do we know he's proud?
My Nile is mine, and I myself have made it.
That's right. That's right. The Pharaoh of Egypt made the Nile. Didn't you guys know that? It's funny.
Oh, sure.
Because Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus both said that God made the whole earth, but Pharaoh must know better. So then God says he's going to do something, and what's he going to do?
Hooks in his jaws.
Make a good video.
Yeah, yes, it would.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jocelyn. Do what? I heard you.
He put hooks in his jaws. He make the fish of the rivers cling to his scales and bring him up out of the midst of the rivers.
Uh-huh. Where's he going to end up?
In the wilderness.
Is that a good place in the open field in the wilderness for a creature of the river?
No.
No. So without much description, we wouldn't even have to kind of guess. Then he adds a picture to it in case we miss what might happen to a river creature left in a field. going to happen.
Foods for the beasts of the earth and the birds of the sky.
There we go again. In case you were lonely for those kind of phrases from Revelation, here's another one for you. So, yeah, not going to go well. But there is going to be a result. Before he even tells us the because and the therefore, we see the pride. We know that's one of the reasons. But God is going to get specific here in a minute. But then he says, when that happens, what's going to be the result?
Inhabitants of Egypt will know that I am the Lord.
Yeah, how many, Stephanie?
Oh,
All of them. All the inhabitants of Egypt will know he is the Lord. Because it sounds like maybe in their nation they don't, because they got a Pharaoh who says he made the Nile. And we know a lot about Egypt. And we're not going to do a whole study right now. We'll probably talk about them over the next 4 weeks. But we've been talking about them quite a bit in Ezekiel. And I just want to refresh our minds just with what we know without having to go look at it. Why do we talk a lot about Egypt? Where does Israel's relationship with Egypt go back to in Scripture?
They turned to them for help.
Way before that.
Oh, you're talking about when they were
Captives.
captive in there?
Yeah.
Slave.
Joseph?
Joseph.
Yeah, Joseph.
Yeah. So Joseph did what? Who's Joseph? You guys are going detailed, so we'll go for it. Joseph.
A son of Jacob?
Okay. Is he supposed to be in Egypt?
No.
Why is he in Egypt?
His brothers sold him.
Yes, but God did that, right? Because there was a famine in the land. And did Joseph end up as a slave when he was in Egypt? No. God made him second in command to Pharaoh. There were pharaohs then too. So yes, the people were enslaved in Egypt for how long?
400 years.
400 years. Did that seem to have much impact on them?
Yes.
Yes, it sure did. In fact, it's having more impact on them, as we learn in Ezekiel, than you probably ever knew before. It has been for me an eye-opener. We knew as they walked through the wilderness that every time something was difficult, they wanted to go back to Egypt. And so we just thought, well, they're a bunch of whiner complainers and wow. But did you always have that question in your mind? Like, why would you want to go back to slavery just because you're tired of eating the same meat? You're not starving to death, but you want to go back. Well, we've learned in Ezekiel why they wanted to go back. What ties, what's drawing them after 400 years of time in Egypt? What has happened to them?
They've become dependent on Egypt for their security, probably everything.
Yeah, Egypt
Yes.
and
The Pharaoh can take care of them.
what have they got in their hearts?
Idols.
Idols.
The gods of Egypt, in their hearts, they have determined, they have held on to a belief that the gods of Egypt were more powerful than their God. Because if they hadn't, why would they keep going back to them? Right? You don't turn to the God that you think is the least powerful. You turn to the God that you think is the most powerful. So think about that if you haven't thought of it that way before. If they're continuing to disobey him and they're worshiping gods in his temple and they're sacrificing children to idols, they have made other gods more important than God. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
And that probably started then with 400 years is a long time, right? It's going to impact you. And even in the way that Dee Dee said, with all the provision, they forgot God, right? That's been one of our other phrases. They forgot God and what God had done for them. And he reminds them of that time after time. So that's why we're talking about Egypt. That might be notes or thoughts you want to have in your mind when you're looking at why is he talking about Egypt for 4 chapters? Probably takes a lot of talking about. And what we want to think about as we go, we'll hit a question eventually about how that relates to us. What's going to be our takeaway? Okay.
They also
ahead.
they let down Israel in more current time, present, I guess, in the present time
Yeah.
by not coming to their defense in a strong way. I think they referred to that in here with the broken reeds and all.
In fact,
You
it's right
couldn't.
where we are, Fran. It's right the
Okay.
next thing. In
All
fact, you
right.
can tell us it's the because. So remember, God, when he's been judging the nations, has been starting with his reason first, the because, and then he gives us a therefore. He says, this is what you did, and this is what I'm going to do. So what's the reason, Fran? What's his because in verse 6? If you guys are tracking with us.
They were staff made of reed. They weren't strong, that you couldn't rely on them you couldn't hold, onto them for security.
Mhm.
And then when you took hold of them, they broke, or you broke. I think
Mhm.
Israel broke, right? And
Um,
toward their
I think
hands.
it's Egypt.
Egypt,
He
okay.
broke and tore their
All
hands.
all the U's.
You Egypt broke and tore their Israel hands. So if you think about reeds, if you've ever gone one, yeah, they feel strong and tough because they're hard to cut and they can be hard to break. But if you were on the bank of a river and the river flooded and was about to sweep you away, would you grab hold of a reed or would you grab hold of a tree log?
Pretty long.
The tree log. You're not going to, those reeds aren't going to hold you. They're going to break because you can cut them and you can break them and they can be sharp when they break off. So that's exactly what Fran was saying is they looked reliable to Israel and they said they would be there for Israel, but they weren't. So God says, yeah, you're proud, but here's my real reason. Once again, we come back to the same reason that God judged every other nation we've read, which is what? What's the general term that you could put for that? You can do specifics in every chapter, but what is the overarching reason God is judging all the other nations?
Pridefulness?
Nope, this part that you brought up.
Oh,
And not blessing Israel.
The not blessing Israel, not supporting Israel, not defending Israel, attacking Israel, boasting over Israel's problems. Everything was based on how they treated his people. Okay. Again, keep in mind our discussion from the beginning of class. Do you think God has changed or not changed? Because that's going to matter to how you look at the chapters where we are and at the chapters where we'll head for part 2. Okay, so they relied on Egypt and Egypt wasn't reliable. Then we get the therefore. So God says, because you did that, because you weren't reliable for them, you didn't really support them, right? That's not a real support if somebody leans on something that breaks off. God says what he's going to do, which is what? Again, some familiar words.
Bring upon you the sword. A
The sword, right? We've been looking at that word because it's whether it's for Israel or whether it's for the other nations, a sword is coming to be part of it. And what's going to be the resulting picture that we saw in this description of Pharaoh being tossed out into the wilderness, what's going to happen to the land of Egypt? It says.
desolation and waste.
Okay, and the result of that will be?
Then they'll know that I am Lord.
And they'll know. So everybody in Egypt's going to know that I'm the Lord. Now, God's got another reason. He's going to go back also to the pride issue, right? He's going to say, in addition to that, because you said the Nile is mine and I have made it, now I'm going to do something else. How does he describe what he's going to do next? Now he's not just against Pharaoh and Egypt, he's against who else?
The rivers.
He's against the rivers. Because God's against the rivers, what's going to happen to Egypt?
There'll be an utter waste and desolation.
Right. Would that make sense if tragedy or your rivers dry up or if something happens to them, is your land going to do well?
No.
Not if you're in Egypt, it's not going to do well without water. It's not going to do well. What's that next part mean, do you suppose? From Migdal to Syene, even to the border of Ethiopia. How would we understand what God's trying to say there?
I think it's the whole from the north to the south and
Yep.
far down to Ethiopia.
Yep. We've had this kind of expression in other places with God where he names the cities and we don't know what they are, but top to bottom, the whole land. That's what he's talking about it. How heavy is this destruction going to be? How big? Do we have a description of it?
For 40 years, it won't be inhabited.
Okay.
No man, no beast, nothing.
Okay. What's going to happen to the people? I guess the Egyptians that aren't destroyed with the sword.
Gonna be scattered.
Yeah. That's an interesting phrase. We don't always see that with other nations except for Israel. So I kind of thought, that one's going to get my attention there, that they're going to be scattered. And I'm tempted to ask you a question of where you think this is coming from, but because he might say in a different chapter, we'll just wait and see. Okay, so 40 years, and then at the end of that time, what's he going to do? He's going to do what?
Going to gather them.
He's going to gather them back. Again, this sounds more like language he usually uses for Israel. However, there's a difference with how Egypt will return to the land that compared to the way God describes how Israel will be after they come back to their land. What's the difference?
It'll be the lowest of
Only
kingdoms.
kingdom.
Yes. So if you think about Egypt, if you look back, Egypt at one time was an empire, right? Like Rome, like Babylon, like Assyria, and was a ruler of nations. And the pharaohs, you only have to look at what this still is built there for them, still standing, to see the kind of power they had. God says, never again will you be that kind of empire. As far as you could think, has that been held true? Has Egypt ever become an empire again? No. Do you ever think much about Egypt unless Israel's in the news? Nah. No. So it looks like God kept his word about that.
When did Cleopatra pop into the history?
You know what? And that's what I'm trying to remember.
Isn't that after?
It's
Yeah.
around the same time as Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
So, but I can't remember my years. So much later, so she was, but wasn't the pharaohs anymore, right? And so I don't know that empire, because Rome was the main empire,
Yeah.
right? So she
And
wouldn't have competed with Rome, but she did have some power.
Yeah, she was, but her beauty, haha.
Yeah, she had that power, that's for sure. Because she kept popping into my mind too, but I thought, yeah, but it was Rome that was the empire. She tried to, I think weasel her way in there, but
I
okay.
just Googled, she was 69 BC to 30 BC.
Okay, so 600 years later, there was an attempt, but Rome was way too powerful. Not quite 600 years, I guess. Okay, so then we have this, what I found to be the most interesting and the most telling verse, and the verse that brought me to make the questions we talked about already, and the one we're going to talk about in a minute. God, without saying this is one of his reasons for what he's doing to Egypt, gives us the reason in verse 16. And I think it's really powerful. What do we learn in verse 16? When he makes them so lowly that they won't rule any other nations, what else will happen?
Never again be the confidence
of the house of Israel.
Whoa. Okay. Too many people tried talking at once. I don't know. Jocelyn?
They will never again be the confidence of the house of Israel.
Oh, when God destroys Egypt or brings them very low, they will never again be the confidence of Israel.
Oh.
Think about that for a minute. Think about when God's people, any of his people, us included, continue to turn our hearts and minds to something that we place above him while we still claim him. What do you think might happen eventually?
It'll teach us a lesson.
Yeah. Do those things ever crumble out from under people?
Absolutely.
Do the people we have to deal with and explain to people why, if that famous man's a pastor, why did he cheat on his wife with those women and do all those things and end up losing his ministry and all that? This is why, right? But what does it do to the ministry? What does it do? But God, we can see it all the time. This idea, I think, that those Jews and those Israelis in Jerusalem in the pot who thought God's never going to destroy his own temple. He's never going to destroy his own city. We can do whatever we want here. Will God remove anything that stands between himself and his people?
Yes.
Believe it.
Yes. And he said that all the way back in that same time frame in Exodus, right? When he made the 10 commandments. No other God before me. So I found this verse really powerful. What do you think then? What does it make you think about? What did he, remember that verse about that he does all these things? It just lives in my mind because there was no other remedy, right? If we think about that here as well, these people would not let go. They would not let go of that draw. And of course there's a satanic power there as well, right? Any other little g gods, if you believe in them or worship them or call to them, it doesn't mean there's not something there. But it doesn't mean, it means it's not God's spirit. It's a demonic spirit. Think of the hold that had on generations of God's people. But he brought them back. He brought them back. Any other thoughts? Go ahead.
Oh,
Sarah.
sorry. It drills down to that same basic argument that goes all the way back, that in spite of everything that God has done from the for them, that because of because of this, that, or the other, that his people will turn on him, that they will not be loyal to him. And so there's always this deception. And I think, clearly that continues to our day. So we just have to remember that argument that's always going on in heaven, that, God has a right to be a jealous God because of everything coming from him and for him. But Satan's trying to take that claim and twist it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think my mind this past couple weeks has been taken right back to the beginning of Ezekiel. And I can't remember why, unless it was the preview for this, that we had that focus on the spiritual realm and the spiritual kingdom. And again, we talked about how difficult it is for us to keep that here, to keep it here. Because I think, and one of you said, because maybe that was you, Jocelyn, who said it's so much easier to look at the real thing standing next to you, right? Which is what Israel kept doing all the time with Egypt. Well, Egypt is right there. Egypt has power and chariots. Go back and read the Psalms and the places that talk about, the chariots. You're not going to be won by chariots, but by God's might and power, because that was might and power to them. And then we want to think about what are those things for us as individuals, but also for us as nations, as we look at these nations being judged, and they're all judged on one criteria. How's the world doing today based on that criteria if God lines up all the nations of the world today? Not well, not well, not well at all. And it makes absolutely no sense without the Bible, because in the Bible, God said, days will come when the entire world will stumble over and hate Jerusalem, Jerusalem will be their stumbling block. It's unbelievable what we're watching. So this is like, I hope that when you watch the news and then you get out your homework, or you do it the other way around, that you're thanking God for putting you in this study at this time, because it's amazing that we're here. This one criteria, and the world is failing today. And they don't know this. Clearly, the world leaders don't know the criteria they're being judged against. Okay, other thoughts on that or that section? See, I can talk even when I shouldn't be.
That it also brings to mind that 16 is I just to me it reflects us like if you're in an addictive state and you fall into that dependency, how it's once you realize that you need to get out of it, like they realized how Egypt was taking them down the bad way. It couldn't be relied on. It was like a drug that they had overcome, and the confidence of having that as a way out of their life or whatever there has been broken. And so I thought that kind of applied as well. It's almost you become so dependent on what you know isn't good for you.
Yeah.
So.
Isn't that the truth? Wow. Yeah. Yeah, and that can be people, and things and drugs. Yeah, you become dependent on those things. And just like them, and we all would have said this and did say it when we studied Exodus as well, that, well, it's what they were comfortable with, right? We used to say that they were just that level they were just more comfortable with the slavery that they knew than what God had for them. But again, where was their trust and where was their faith? And now that idea makes so much more sense, that it wasn't just their comfort, that it was their hearts tied to those gods as well, that they had relied on that. And think of how difficult it would be, which is why we don't want people to start down that path, right? And now that's such another big cultural trend where we are, is witchcraft and things that are like witchcraft, even in the church. And if people start down that path, Satan is right there to say, come on in, I'll take you. Come on, I'll take you for a ride, and you'll like it for a while. If you guys don't know, if you know people that deal with the occult, and if you haven't ever watched much from Pastor Billy Crone, watch Pastor Billy Crone on the occult, because he came out of the occult, and he's an interesting guy. Just know that he's a pastor in Las Vegas. That's pretty much what you'd expect, but he's got a reason to speak on this topic, and he covers a lot of it all the time because his heart is for that ministry. So if you need a word for people on the occult, you can look up almost anything from Pastor Billy Crone. I can't remember the name of his church. I think it's got the word son in it, but which it would in Las Vegas. But anyway, if you look up Billy Crone, C-R-O-N-E, you'll find that. I just gave a pastor a plug on the internet. Hey, okay, well, good. Anything else from through there? Because we're going to really jump and change direction here in a second. We're not going to change direction. We're going to change time, but we're not going to change direction.
I just thought it was so interesting how I didn't have time to drill down to the actual original language, but it just sounded so extremely familiar. Scatter, gather, scatter, gather, when he's referring to the nations. And we always think about that only related to Israel, but ultimately, I think these chapters are so much about how God is in control. He's in control of it all. So in spite of whether that's as we think things should play out or not, it is what it is. He is in control, and he will scatter and gather according to his plan and according to his needs. And, those who are faithful to him are giving the warnings, and they're watching. And so that's another thing that I think is just so applicable to us today, is a lot of times we just in the context consider that these things only apply to, those other people, not us, those other people. But he's truly talking about all the nations. Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. All, including his own, right? His own. Yeah. Okay, so what happens in verse 17?
The prophecy moves forward in time and changes the person it's talking about.
Yeah. Well, yeah, sort of changes person. He's going to add a part of a person in this prophecy. So how far in time does it go? You don't have to do the math. Just tell me what it says and I'll bring up the slide.
27th year, and I think that's 17 years in the future.
Yeah, because we were in the 10th year. So let me bring that timeline up again. You guys can get yours out. And because we need to talk about this. Well, we'll need to talk about it more next week. But so here's where we were. Here's where we are. Let me see if I made a slide with the date on it too. I think I did. So that's what you would put now. Yeah, I did. Now you would write 2917 right here. And then in your margin at verse 17, what year are you going to put?
570.
570. Okay, now if you've read ahead, or if you're already looking at the timeline, can you tell me already if these chapters, is this going to be chronological completely here? What we're going to cover? No, because you can see that there are going to be chapters that have headings in here in the 11th and 12th years. But give me just one very simple logical reason why God might put this part in here right now, even though it's not the next thing. Sometimes, why would you tell a story out of order, Aditi?
Because it's what's going to happen to Egypt.
Yeah, it fits this narrative, and it makes sense in order of the narrative, but there's also then a reason why he gives it to him in that other year, but he puts it here in this work. It's a little bit jumpier for us to follow, but that's the benefit of the real time and God's detail that we get to see. Oh, wow, look what he did. So who's this other person he brings into the picture?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar. See, I knew I didn't need to ask the question earlier. Why does he bring in Nebuchadnezzar? And who was that? Just for our listeners at home.
King of
The
Babylon.
king of Babylon.
The king of Babylon.
Yeah.
So we've got a pharaoh in Egypt. Now he's talking about the king of Babylon, and he's talking about a nation we're already done talking about. So what's he talking about in relationship to Nebuchadnezzar?
He took advantage of the people. Yeah.
God used Nebuchadnezzar to attack Tyre.
Yeah.
And it's like a 13-year siege.
Yeah.
Really threw his army down. And so God is rewarding Tyre or Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon with the I guess the rewards or the spoils of war.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
Actually, I'm thinking, did Egypt pull some of what was the riches of Tyre down to their area? There had to have been some reason why, there was some collusion there going on.
Yes, I believe I saw that there was some of that Egypt actually helped Tyre instead of Nebuchadnezzar. So yeah, so if you're kind of looking at how to track this, verse 18 is what we're talking about with Nebuchadnezzar. He said he had to labor hard against Tyre, and as Fran said, 13 years is one of the time frames. It took him a long time to conquer them because of their physical position. Then there's that word that you want to mark, but he and his army had no wages. They didn't have any spoils from Tyre, again, because of their position. So while Nebuchadnezzar is trying to destroy that mainland fortress, meanwhile, Tyre has a coastal city off on an island where they can ship everything away. So there's no spoils. They got rid of everything. And now, so God says, He's going to do two things. He's giving him what? So even though he didn't get the rewards from Tyre, what's God giving Nebuchadnezzar instead?
The land and the wealth.
Of Egypt.
The land and wealth of Egypt as his spoil and plunder. And that will be wages for his army. And then he says why. So Fran had it all summarized really well. But verse 20 says why he's doing it. Because they did what? What did Nebuchadnezzar do when he destroyed Tyre?
They acted for me.
Acted for me. That labor, and that labor was the word used in 18, which was fighting against Tyre. He said he did that for me, which we already read about for 3 chapters in chapters 26, 27, and 28. And we talked about how difficult it was. So that's, again, as Sarah was saying earlier, you can watch God move kings and nations around like chess pieces on a board. And that's why Psalm 2 says, they can gather together, they can plot against me, but God says he sits in the heavens and laughs because he knows they're not in control. And the wise kings like Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus, they knew who was in control too. They knew God was, and they declared it. And they got rewarded for a while, at least, right? And then, as we know, God's complete justice comes into play, because does Babylon last forever? No, it doesn't either. Okay, and then he ends with a piece of another interesting information in verse 21, changes topics completely.
We'll make a horns.
Yes, somebody was talking.
Oh, I really stuck on the time there on that
Oh,
day.
yeah.
Thinking that maybe dual.
Yeah, I think so. I think we could say this
Okay.
one's one we would mark as a definite dual prophecy. But what's going to happen on that day, on whatever day that?
God will make a horn sprout for the house of Israel.
Okay, when God uses that phrase, a horn sprout, can anybody tell us, like, it's sort of a symbolic expression? What does it represent?
Strength.
So somebody said, what'd you say?
Strength.
Strength?
Yeah. Strong.
Yeah, strength, power, might. Yeah, it's a symbol of power.
Mhm.
So he's going to make a mighty for the house of Israel. And there's 2 more things.
Oh,
Open your mouth in their midst. And I thought Ezekiel, but I'm very confused about that one.
Yeah, no, it is Ezekiel, except his mouth's already been open. So you'll get more of this picture as we go. Do you think they're still listening to him even though he's been allowed to speak? How did they feel when he talked? He told God about this once. He's going to mention it again later, I think. Any thoughts on whether or not they're good listeners?
Don't think they're listening to him.
They're not. So what do you think God is saying here, since we know he's actually already kept him from being mute? If he's really going to open his mouth, do you think the picture will be different?
They'll start
Yeah.
listening.
That's right, because they're going to see some prophecies fulfilled, which they already have, but that's kind of the gist of what they're saying here. It's not that because you might be saying, oh, we already saw that he already opened his mouth, but there's a bigger opening.
that horn could be like a listening ear, horn. No.
They could use one of those. And then when all this happens, what will happen for the people?
They'll know.
They'll know that I am Lord. For those of you that are tracking on your sheet, you probably have a good idea that there's a lot of these statements in Ezekiel. I saw the number the other day, but I can't remember what it was, but it's a lot. So they will know that he is the Lord. Okay, thoughts, questions, other impact? That's all 29 is. That's I've got a couple questions for you to think about. So as we've been talking about that hold that Egypt has on the heart of Israel, right? Egypt, it's the gods, the idols, I think is a good word, because idols is a better word for us, right? It's always best when we put those words into the words that we're most likely to think, oh yeah, that might be me too. So gods may not be a word that you think, oh, that's my word too, but idols might be, right? We all have to battle that. If we don't think we have to battle that, then we probably also have to battle pride, right? So it's best to just say you battle idols or you've worked on getting yours down or whatever. So we want to think about that. If we think about this judgment God's bringing just to get rid of that, you want to kind of keep that in your mind, how to compare that to our individual lives. And we've talked about that in regard to the nations as well, because we can't help that because we're looking at God judging nations. So here's the question I think kind of ties this all together. So what does it say to us if all these chapters of judgment on the nations, on Israel and on the nations, in part one, what we're calling part one of the study of Ezekiel, and then part two of Ezekiel jumps to the future? It's like there's a gap, right? Here's these things that happen, but it was all warning of judgment for nations. And they all represent, we've said how familiar that feels, right? So this has been my thought. Why wouldn't today feel like what God's describing to Ezekiel? Because it should, because we're right at the end of when he's getting ready to complete that judgment, but then he does the next thing that he says he's going to do. So if we believe that those things happen in an order, do you think that that could mean that there's an order right now that's falling into place as well? And so if our time right now seems to line up with what the people in Ezekiel's day were going through, what would you expect to be the next events on the calendar? Where would I expect to find them? I think I would find them in Ezekiel part two. So that's a really good promotion for why you should try to make really good time for Ezekiel part two. You need to be thinking of that and talk to that. Where are we on God's timeline? We don't know exactly, but as Jesus told the disciples, you know how to look at the weather and determine the seasons. You should know the signs of the times. That's what he told the disciples when they asked him about the timing of the events of the end days. And I think that's a pretty good description of that he expects us to be able to watch and see. So other thoughts, questions?
You know, I'm just totally amazed after hearing that phrase, then they will know.
Mm-hmm.
God has no limitations of doing whatever is necessary, only for that one reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe he can still do that today.
Mm-hmm.
So what, and I asked myself the question, okay, what would it take, Pat, for you to know that he is the Lord? What's it going to take?
Mm-hmm.
Because he'll do whatever's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's very important that they know who the Lord is.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be today too.
Yes, it is today. Yeah, so it's best to just know who he is, don't you think?
Yes.
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 I think that sounds the safest. Yeah.
I think this is also a claim that just kind of piggybacking off of what Pat was saying. I think it's also a claim that God is making before his accuser that he's a just God. When we make our choice, there will be no doubt. They know who's Lord. They know who's in control. And this isn't just the Israelites, it's the nations. And so he's making these claims to us in Ezekiel, and it's prophesied through Ezekiel. I gave Egypt to Babylon. I controlled this. I did it. And I'm telling you before it happened as a sign so that you know, and you know, and you know, so that there's no doubt. And this is a claim to him being a just God. It's a claim that he doesn't randomly judge us and we're innocent or ignorant of what the rules are or what the reality is or who's really in control.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to butcher this, but I saw, and I don't even remember who he had with him. Tom Hughes, Pastor Tom Hughes had somebody on with him, and surprise, surprise, they were talking about the end times. And I heard him describe this in a way I've never heard before. So before he was a pastor, he was a real estate agent, or he did stuff. You all know I'm not a money person, so I didn't even pay any attention to our mortgage stuff. So apparently, if you own a property, as God owns the world, right? So he's making this, we've talked about this before, as Jesus is coming back to redeem the earth, to redeem the land. If you did kinsman redeemer or even covenant, you know that it's like Jesus, like as if the scroll is the title deed to the earth, and that's why Jesus gets to open it. And then all these judgments happen. And these judgments have to happen before God comes back and destroys people. They have to be judgments, but that's because there has to be justice. So he said, somebody maybe knows on this, he dealt with titles. And before you can go and take the deed of a property from a person, you have to go through the list of judgments against that property. They're called judgments, right? They're the things that have to be met for that property before the transfer of ownership can take place. Isn't that amazing? Like God even made the way we transfer property a picture of what he's doing when he comes back. So anyway, Sarah's words just brought that back to my mind, but his justice works that way. And I believe that that is actually a blessing of where we are. I fully believe, because God says it and he pictures it all the way through Revelation, that before a day comes when there is no turning back, he gives everyone every opportunity, that those judgments and that tribulation and those trials are so that people will know, they know it's him, and they will turn to him. And that's the kind of God we have, that before he puts that date, and just like this, when he said because there was no other remedy. And he warn them for years and years and years before he brought these judgments? Yeah, even just in the book of Ezekiel, we've watched how long he's been warning, but we know it went on. So that's the God that we have. That's his kind of justice. Justice, I promise you, I would not have the patience for myself, right? The kind of long suffering that he will have to wait to make sure that not one person misses the opportunity to turn to him. And that's part of what we can share with people, is that he says he doesn't desire the death of even the wicked. He wants them to have life. All right, any other thoughts? So again, that's the best way to kind of handle these, where you're going to stay with one topic for chapter after chapter. Keep reminding yourself, keep asking yourself why. What's God trying to bring home to us? How does it relate? And that will get you going. So before I end the video, so any of you watching will know, just do, it's Ezekiel chapter 30 for next week, and it's just day 2 in the homework. So again, you're always free to work ahead, but that's what we'll be discussing next week. And so with that, I'm going to close the video and we'll do prayer time. And I hope to see you guys next time.